This is Company Breakdowns from Turpentine, a deep dive on a compelling tech company's strengths, TAM, business model, and potential for market domination. Today's episode focuses on Delta Airlines, as Lorenzo Bartolini sits down with Gary Leff, aviation industry expert and writer of View from the Wing. They discuss Delta's 100-year transformation from a crop dusting company to America's premium airline, exploring its strategic advantages, loyalty program economics, and the future of air travel. From airport slot acquisitions to the billion-dollar credit card business, this conversation reveals how Delta built its competitive moat in one of the most challenging industries.
Hey, welcome back to another episode of Company Breakdowns. I'm Lorenzo, and I'm joined here by the wonderful Gary Leff, who I've been a fan of for the better part of a decade, probably. His wonderful website, A View from the Wing, is probably one of the best sources for all things aviation and credit card points. I'm sure I'll let him talk about it in just a moment. But today we'll be talking about one of my favorite companies, Delta Airlines. I've been a loyal SkyMiles member since 1999. The app likes to remind me every July. So excited to get into the nitty-gritty conversation with you, Gary. But yeah, feel free to give yourself an intro.
Yeah, sure. So I do write viewfromthewing.com, which I've been doing since 2002. I lived in DC for 18 years. And back then, early days of blogs, all of my friends were beginning to write political blogs. And I realized, there wasn't anything truly unique in the world that I had to say that nobody else was saying in that space. But, everyone was playing around with this format, this medium, and I would write about the things that people were always asking me about. And so I was writing from a consumer perspective about travel, air travel, hotels, deals, and whatnot. And over time, I, just would apply my own outside experience and reading and training in economics as professionally as a CFO in terms of looking at the news of the day and bringing that to consumers of travel and of loyalty programs and travel experience. And so that's what I write about. I still do work as a CFO as well, and I write everything on my site myself, and I have since the beginning. And so it's just sort of my take on the news of travel, opportunities in frequent flyer programs, loyalty, who's got the best products, whose onboard burgers are best.
Only out of Boston right now they're serving it, right? If I remember, for the Shake Shack deal.
So this is expanding. Delta's expanding theirs. United has already had their onboard burger. And an American has now entered this sort of burger race. Theirs starts out of Chicago, and they're expanding as well with a first class pre-order.
Actually, a fun factoid. My very first, I'm sure this is not the onboard burger of today, but my very first hamburger that I'd ever had, I think, was on a United flight like 20 something years ago. But I remember it as extremely very unique experience of the online airline burger.
Yeah, so in 2001, United was experimenting with they called a gourmet cheeseburger. It was controversial at the time because it was basically replacing the idea of steak. And so, I mean, back then, first class meals were, more robust, kind of a nicer experience. And this was a cutback. So the idea of doing this was really big. The bun was really large as well.
I remember having difficulty getting my mouth around it. That's right.
Yeah. And so they were, but it was a cost cut. But the burger that they were doing at the time really was, gourmet relative to what we're seeing on board now. Very different kind of idea. And there are other, airlines that do burgers in the world. Some of them quite well. ANA out of Japan has done a good burger for a while. Some airlines attempt the fries. Delta's not trying to do the fries on board. It's really hard to reheat fries. They're not doing,
I can imagine. I've tried at home.
and they're not doing a like onboard actually frying of them. So it's a heating exercise. United does. I've had them. They're awful. I've had good fries and less good fries on Etihad out of Abu Dhabi, of all things. American does intend to offer the fries. So, we'll see how that goes.
I've been flying for the better part of my whole life, but it's only felt like in the past 3-4 years that suddenly Delta has become somewhat ubiquitous with luxury, a leader in the market. That was not in my mind, a very clear position, certainly 10 years ago. So I'd love to just go back. Maybe we can talk, very briefly about the history of Delta Airlines, how it's come to be. I know obviously there's like a whole history of regulation, deregulation, M&A. So, at a high level, talk us through that, and really, we'll get to how it became what it is today.
Yeah, so Delta actually says that this is their 100th anniversary this year. It's kind of an interesting, what do you call the beginning? The company, the corporate entity that ultimately, they trace back to, it was a crop dusting company in 1925. This was not a passenger airline, right? It was 3 years before there was passenger involvement. They actually do, date back to another company. The original entity of Northwest Airlines dates to 1926. And I think this is a stronger argument for 1926. They're very attached to 1925. This is their 100th anniversary.
They like the quarter century marker, but we'll be raising the flag next year, you and me, Gary.
Yeah, but so they were this crop dusting company in 1925. They, grew into passenger service out of airmail as most of the early airlines did. They lost that business in 1930. There was something called the airmail scandal where the, postmaster general basically got together with a few airlines and divvied up the market himself. So because, because mail at the time was the primary revenue source that was driving a lot of the development of the airlines, it turned out to be this huge scandal. All the private airmail contracts were canceled, and then the Air Force, the Army, actually took over delivery of the mail. That went very badly.
How big could the airmail market have been in the 1930s?
Well, for when you're flying single engine Ford trimotors, it doesn't have to be huge. And at the time, the airlines were being paid on weight, but the mail was being charged by the piece. And so what a lot of airlines would do for themselves is, ship bricks to themselves along their own routes, right? Because there was an arbitrage to be had. But when this developed very badly with the military takeover of the mail under FDR, they finally gave it back to private companies. But none of the companies that had previously had airmail contracts were eligible, and so they all renamed themselves with different executives. And American Airways became Airlines, like at this point.
I always wondered how they kind of chose these kind of haphazard airlines, airways, two words, one word. So it's all just a branding exercise.
Yeah, so they had to change the entity, back then in order to qualify in 1934. But in any case, Delta began its passenger service out of Dallas, actually. It was only later it expanded into Atlanta. Delta is named for the Mississippi Delta. It was where that name comes from. But they were a successful carrier throughout the 30s and the 40s, and they bought a Chicago-based airline in the early 1950s. And they did grow through acquisition, Northeast Airlines, but it was really post deregulation that they blew up in their success, as it were. And I mean, they bought Western Airlines in 1987, which is where they get their Salt Lake hub from. They bought when Pan Am went bankrupt. They bought Pan Am's, most of the Pan Am corpus, but Pan Am's Europe routes, and they became the largest U.S. airline, to Europe with that acquisition in 1991, I want to say. In fact, by 1997, they were the first passenger airline to carry 100 million passengers. Which airline was the largest at any given time went back and forth. A lot of this had to do with mergers and acquisitions. So, Delta was early after 9/11, and there was a long period of post-deregulation where, airlines that had these legacy costs from the regulated era were struggling in a lot of ways.
I was actually, in fact, surprised to find that I was doing research for this, saw one infographic where Southwest for a long time was actually one of the largest airlines of the nation, which wouldn't have occurred to me given their position today.
Well, so they are the largest carrier of domestic passengers. They just don't have the long haul operation. They began as a regulatory arbitrage. So in the regulated era, But people misunderstand about airline regulation. They think that it was somehow
Yeah, maybe we can back up. So what was this schism pre and post regulation? What was the regulation actually entailing, and how did it lead to this kind of unique market position?
so there was a belief that airlines, in order to be able to invest in safety, had to be profitable, right? So that if they weren't profitable, they would, cut corners. And we know now that's very much not true, because all the major carriers, other than Southwest, have been through bankruptcy and continued, very, very much investing in safety. But this belief led to a regulatory regime that was meant to ensure profits and prevent competition, right? They used to refer to as ruinous competition. And so the Civil Aeronautics Board was in charge of was deciding what airlines could fly where and what prices they could charge. And they were basically a public utility model of cost plus. You would bring a rate case to the government agency who would approve pricing. And in fact, there was antitrust exemption granted to IATA, basically the world regulator.
I learned about this in an economics class once upon a time. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, lobbying body for the airlines, for them to set rates internationally. And so,
Which is crazy to think of today, because they argue against it, as foreign-backed airlines kind of do the same on many routes now.
yeah, but this was, in fact, I mean, the Department of Transportation has the authority to grant antitrust exemption coming out of this era, because they were given the authority to grant it to IATA. And it's that authority that they then base current antitrust exemptions for joint ventures between US and foreign carriers, based on. That's actually where the legal authority comes from. But in the regulated era, the government was ensuring that airlines were profitable. They decided who could fly where and at what prices they could charge, and these were set at above market clearing prices. And so airlines actually wanted to still compete, because each incremental passenger was so profitable. And so the Civil Aeronautics Board would find ways to try to combat that, because what the airlines would do would they would serve such luxurious food on board to try to compete for passengers, because they couldn't compete on price. There actually was a Civil Aeronautics Board hearing where they discussed whether they needed to regulate the thickness of sandwiches to prevent this competition, right?
We'll get back to the conversation in a moment after a word from our sponsors. What does the future hold for business? Ask 9 experts and you'll get 10 answers. It's a bull market. It's a bear market. Rates will rise or fall. Can someone invent a crystal ball? Until then, over 41,000 businesses have future-proofed their business with NetSuite by Oracle, the #1 cloud ERP, bringing accounting, financial management, inventory, HR into one fluid platform. With one unified business management suite, there's one source of truth, giving you the visibility and control you need to make quick decisions. With real-time insights and forecasting, you're peering into the future with actionable data. When you're closing the books in days and not weeks, you're spending less time looking backwards and more time on what's next. If I had needed this product, it's what I'd use. Whether your company is earning millions or even hundreds of millions, NetSuite helps you respond to immediate challenges and seize your biggest opportunities. Speaking of opportunity, download the CFO's Guide to AI and Machine Learning at netsuite.com/zen. The guide is free to you at netsuite.com/zen. netsuite.com/zen.
So you're selling enterprise SaaS, and a prospect asks you about how your API manages access. Who does sales call? Linda, because they always call Linda. Linda, who heroically put together a color-coded map of authentication mechanisms and fine-grained access controls. Linda, who tells you she doesn't mind, because technically correct is the only acceptable form of correct. Linda, who certainly didn't get a bachelor's in science and work her entire career so that she could redundantly respond to inbound security questionnaires with 50 shades of the same API question. Every company has a Linda, or will someday find it needs one. Or maybe you're already at the scale where you have dozens. Regardless of your size and sophistication, you can help your Linda help you with SafeBase, the leading trust center platform. SafeBase AI helps distill what Linda knows so that your sales team can field questionnaires proactively and accurately, even when Linda is on well-deserved PTO. SafeBase has workflow integrations with Slack, Salesforce, Teams, and more to streamline collaboration with Linda and help close deals faster. SafeBase can accelerate your sales process so much that some customers see time to value in as little as 16 days. That's not just fluff. There's a graph in the dashboard benchmarking you against your peers. Earn the trust of your customers with true, speedy responses to the questions that matter to them. Go to safebase.io/podcast to learn more. Do it for Linda.
So Southwest Airlines was started as an intra-Texas airline because they weren't going to cross state lines, and they were not the first one to do this. They were following a model that had been developed already in California, but by avoiding the crossing state lines, they weren't subject to CAB regulation, and they could charge whatever prices they wanted. And they could undercut the prices that were being charged by national carriers, and so that's how they built their market, was undercutting existing prices, and they were legally protected, right? Nobody could match them. Come 1976, the airline deregulation took place in 78. Come 76, the Civil Aeronautics Board was engaging in what they called experiments in price competition. And so they were allowing trans-Texas airlines to offer peanuts fares, they called it. They were they were undercutting Southwest's fares. Southwest would charge $26, they would charge 13. And so Southwest in 1977 responded to actual price competition with a two-tiered pricing model. You could pay their full price of $26, or if you were on a company dime, you're not going to take the $13 discount fare. You pay the $26 and you get a free fifth of alcohol to take with you. And in 1977, Southwest Airlines became the largest liquor distributor in the state of Texas.
There you go. Oh my goodness. What a statistic. I never would have guessed that.
But the point of bringing up what was going on in the regulated era is, in this regulated utility model of cost plus pricing, you just have continually rising costs on the part of the airlines that they could pass on to the consumer. And they were protected from competition, and that happened in lots of ways. It happened in wages. Like, you didn't want to have a strike on the part of your union because every flight is profitable, and so you just keep negotiating up wages, and it became a pretty good place to a pretty good industry to work. But once competition was introduced, these high cost businesses, right, were not well suited to that new market structure. And so there were a series of renegotiations, lots of mergers. There were bankruptcies, going out of business. Look, Pan Am, which Delta acquired much of, United bought their Pacific routes, but Delta bought most of Pan Am. Pan Am had this problem where, look, they were protected. They were the primary international flag carrier of the United States. They didn't have a domestic route network. They didn't need one because every airline just brought them their passengers. Right. And then when other airlines were able to compete internationally, right, but with their own domestic feed, Pan Am had a problem. Now, so Pan Am had other problems too because of their role in the U.S. They were historically even a tool of U.S. diplomacy, and and so they were also a huge target. And so as a target of terrorism, and they had they developed this brand problem and consumer confidence problem. But they tried to restructure, but they eventually went bankrupt and sold off their assets. But and Delta acquired much of that. But Delta eventually went bankrupt 21 years ago. United put theirs off for a while. They filed in 2002. It was at the time the longest corporate bankruptcy in history. But one by one, the major airlines finally, especially triggered after 9/11, which collapsed demand for air travel. But it wasn't the first time that they struggled. The first Gulf War led to a spike in oil prices. And I think we'll get to talking about the drivers of cost in the industry.
So then I think that's a good point for me to ask one question, which is, we're talking in the wake of 9/11, post 2001, there's somewhat like of a tabula rasa in the competitive landscape, at least with, these big three legacy carriers, all of which, in their own way have benefited from a lot of M&A following this deregulation. They're of similar sizes, which is to say, all contenders. How is it then, if we follow the evolution of the big three legacy players, new and old entrants alike, Southwest, JetBlue, low cost, et cetera? How have we then in the last 25 years evolved to the landscape we see today?
Well, so Delta acquired, after its bankruptcy, acquired Northwest Airlines, right? United and Continental merged. There were long stories that get to these places. America West after 9/11 is going to go bankrupt. They got federal subsidies that kept them in business. And then they sort of turned themselves around and acquired US Airways out of its second bankruptcy. And then they tried to acquire Delta out of its bankruptcy.
I didn't know that, really.
So US Airways tried to do a deal with United twice. The second time effectively pushing United and Continental to do their deal. They tried to acquire American Transair, the assets of which went to Southwest. They tried, ultimately did acquire American Airlines.
Yeah, the reverse merger, right? Yeah.
Right? They weren't able to do the deal with Delta. They did, the creditors committee ultimately turned them down. They kept raising their offer. They were up to around 11 billion, and it wasn't clear whether they would. But there was also a grassroots campaign of employees and customers even who were opposed to this, called "Keep Delta My Delta."
And is that, I mean, I don't even have like a sense, but like $11 billion as a valuation for an airline, thinking of today's numbers again, it kind of like doesn't even, put ripples in the pond, but it feels like something that might have been crazy to think about at the time.
Oh, look, Doug Parker, who was CEO of US Airways at the time, called Delta's own estimate of a post-exit valuation of 9.5 to 13 billion as basically being insane. Like that there was no universe in which, that was at all plausible.
How could you possibly concoct that value? Right, right.
Right. It was self-serving, it was made up, right? Although then he comes up with, his own numbers that basically offering, the midpoint of their numbers. But it was pretty aggressive. Like but the point being there was a number of acquisitions merging together some of the large players in the industry. They all effectively got their deal done to reduce the number of airlines and to enlarge themselves. But, a lot of the growth has been organic as well. And Southwest has done acquisitions. They acquired AirTran, although most of the assets they acquired, they eventually shed. The fleet of Boeing 717s went to Delta in an incredibly good deal for Delta. Southwest basically paid to retrofit the planes for Delta to take them off their hands. Many of the gates and slots that they acquired in congested markets from AirTran, they're simply no longer using. So that probably didn't turn out to be such a strong deal. They did get the ATA assets at Chicago Midway. That was certainly valuable, but a number of acquisitions. Delta probably did its best strategic deal not in the form of an acquisition of another airline, but in the form of gates and slots, and that was a deal with US Airways.
Maybe backing up again on context there. Talk briefly about the importance of these gate. Like, how is that a limiting factor for airlines? I think, the average consumer might not even be aware of this like transaction market that's going on there.
Look, at the majority of airports in the country, the airport wants air service. They've got room for air service. They would be thrilled for an airline to show up. But at the most desirable airports to fly into, the binding constraint is not, airline willingness to add flights, it's the infrastructure capacity. There may not be enough, runways to support more flights, and there may not be land to expand to, or the political environment might not allow expansion, right? The local community opposition, whether because of noise or what have you. And so, as this is especially true in the Northeast, there just aren't more gates to be had. And at New York JFK and LaGuardia in particular, and National Airport in DC, there's a limitation on the number of takeoff and landing slots. Now, this is very common in countries other than the US, but these are the only 3 airports that are specifically actually slot restricted, where you have specific takeoff and landing times, and airlines trade these in a sort of gray market and sell them to each other or lease them in a gray market. And Delta really acquired its New York operation and its significant presence by a series of strategic deals. They swapped much of their operation at National Airport in DC with US Airways for the US Airways portfolio of slots at LaGuardia. And they got more and more valuable slots than they gave up at Delta, so they threw in a bunch of cash. And both sides had to give up some slots to other airlines in that process because the federal government was concerned about competition.
And so, sorry, on a macro level, is this like fundamentally a hedge in favor of the New York market as opposed to DC, or is there some more nuance there that I'm missing?
Well, there is some nuance because they got more than they gave in terms of the presence. And they had to give up some remedy slots that were taken by WestJet, and that's how WestJet,
To encourage competition, fine.
yeah, WestJet got into LaGuardia. WestJet then enters a deal with Delta, and WestJet leaves the market and leases the slots back to Delta,
Which is now, of course, Delta Connection, right? Yes.
which somehow or other, the federal government wouldn't allow Delta to have the slots. They let them have them.
Yeah, how did that one sneak through?
And when United decided that they were losing money at New York JFK under Jeff Smisek, they left the JFK market and leased those slots to Delta. And so Delta methodically, really put together its position in New York.
And so maybe again on that second deal, I'm not sure the extent to which you know the details, but like, is that again just, they'll have a competitive process? Delta came in with a higher, valuation for the slots than I imagine American whomever else, or how does that work?
I mean, so these things aren't usually negotiated in public, in a sort of a public auction, but Delta was certainly the buyer, the most motivated buyer. Delta had an early vision of competing aggressively in New York, and that paid off for it in a lot of ways. New York as a market is not necessarily as good just for flying aircraft as like their Atlanta market is, because it is still a very competitive market, even though they have a very strong position. One of the things, though, that it did for Delta is it raised Delta's profile and gave it a huge presence in an important spending market. Because one of the things that we should talk about is the role of co-brand credit cards in the airlines. And Delta has the largest revenue deal, and part of that is they've been assembling a lot of building blocks, right? So one of those building blocks is their presence in New York, which you can't just go into. There's also certainly gate constrained in Los Angeles.
And that would be a very long-term moat to consider as we actually talk about the slots and the gate restrictions, right? Like that's real infrastructure that they have covered, which like even if they didn't want to, they're in it, but obviously they want to be there.
Yeah, I mean they could lease it out to someone else, but it is a moat because it's not something, American describes its position in New York, and I mean ironically, after U.S. Airways divested its New York slot position, it acquired American, and then says, look, now we have this too small of a presence in New York. The way that they describe it is too big to quit, too small to win. Right. And so
For themselves. Got it. Yeah.
for themselves, right? At American, you have, Delta with a huge position in New York, United out of Newark with a LaGuardia position as well. And then American and JetBlue are smaller there, and neither one, and which is why the two of those airlines,
The ill-fated alliance, yeah.
right, sought to connect up to together be large enough to compete with Delta and United. But Delta's also, assembled a significant real estate position in Los Angeles, another big spend market, but also connecting two very important business markets. They've been they've been willing to play a long game. And some in the industry deride what they call strategic flying, which is being willing to lose money on a route or in a city. They've been doing it in Seattle, but it's also helped them take significant corporate business. They have this incredible hub in Atlanta that they've had in one form or another for 70 years. I mean, it was probably in the 1950s that the phrase was coined that, when you die, whether you're going to heaven or hell, you're going to have to connect in Atlanta, right? Delta stands for diverts errant luggage to Atlanta. And this dates back to long before I was born.
Before we talk about credit card points and this kind of external to flying, let's talk about really the core of the flying experience outside of the actual metal that you're on is the airports you go through. So what about the networks? I know that's one way in which, like, domestically and internationally, at least, Delta and United have differentiated. So let's talk about the evolution there.
Yeah, so we were talking about how Delta was putting together pieces in major cities, establishing their presence in ways that couldn't necessarily be easily replicated. They also worked really hard in terms of their operation, their on-time performance, and building a maintenance capability that isn't really matched. For a lot of airlines, it's a huge cost center. They've turned theirs into a profit center, doing significant work for other carriers. They've done deals where they've acquired aircraft and aircraft engines, and those deals require the engine manufacturer to do maintenance work with them as well.
I'd actually like to underline the ingenuity of that. Like turning a major cost center into a revenue driver is something that actually, we talk about business model innovations on the show, but that's really something unique in terms of, just the capability, the investment that's required on both a CapEx level and just personnel to be able to handle that and in the complexity of their network is really impressive.
And with this, sort of excess capacity is one of the ways they've been able to take, I mean, frankly, often older aircraft and maintain them well enough that they've been able to perform at least marginally better, but certainly better than, better than, but at least marginally better in terms of their on-time performance and just flight completion factors.
You took the words out of my mouth. I mean, there's an additional efficiency on the aircraft, as you say, of having, older aircraft. You've got pilots who are already trained on it just from like IP capacity, but also just again, yeah, you can work that same metal for however many years longer, and that saves you a ton of money. I mean, I think there was one plane that I saw in my Flighty app that was some 40 years old, and they just, keep working these, and then, that's the least of it amongst them. So it's really, you see it throughout the entire network.
And some of that comes from the Northwest DNA. So, Northwest wasn't necessarily as reliable, but they made a tremendous use out of older aircraft. Richard Anderson had come from the Northwest side when he had been CEO of Delta. So they had taken lots of these building blocks, and then some of it was also the customer experience. Delta was always strong in terms of hospitality. Delta's pilots are unionized. It's not the only work group, but they are largely non-union. They also pay their employees better for the most part than competitors. But what they've been able to do is they also outsource more. So their employees are very well paid and well treated, but they keep their costs low with outsourcing in a way that many of the other competitors aren't able to match. So American Airlines, for instance, has 30,000 more employees than Delta does, and that's one of the reasons too. It's not just that Delta has higher profits, but their profit sharing payments are higher. Both because of the higher denominator, but because of the lower denominator. If you were to share it across. But, one of the things that you find is that employees overall are happier. United's flight attendant union surveyed their flight attendants, and 91% of them said they have issues at their airline that are unresolved. Now that's the union reporting, and maybe there's some self-serving data, but the point is that you've got generally happy employees who are proud of a product, who are friendly with their customers. The customers like sort of following the Southwest model. You've heard Kelleher used to say that you take care of your employees, the employees take care of the customers take care of shareholders, right? And that was the direction that was the order that you worried about the things in.
I've always wondered, I do actually believe, and obviously this changes from flight to flight, and no experience is generalizable, but I have found that Delta flight attendants have generally been more convivial, more involved and whatnot. And I've always wondered, like, is that just like a focus on more training? But it really sounds as if it's a ingrained cultural component that as you're, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, so it isn't just the union thing, right? Because Southwest Airlines flight attendants are unionized, and they are happy to be there.
So what's the special sauce?
Yeah, I mean, but Southwest is also really good at talent selection. They select for employees that are going to be this way. And I'm not sure that other airlines have done, super well with that. American about 8 years ago talked about how getting into their flight attendant training classes was, harder than getting into Harvard in terms of just sheer mathematical, thing. But as okay, if that's true, then you're probably not very good on the filtering side of it, right? Because if it was that difficult, you probably would outperform, and I'm not clear that's the case. But part of the problem there is that American never gave employees, at least under current management, any sort of a mission. At Southwest, they were on a mission. They were the underdogs. They were always under threat. from bigger airlines. Whereas at American, their CEO was quoted as saying that he didn't think profit sharing was appropriate for flight attendants because they don't affect profit. Like, that was the message. Like, so I mean, the culture matters a lot. Also, if you're at a cost cutter, you aren't necessarily getting the product that you're proud of to deliver, and so you're not. And you also may not be getting a clear message about what management is asking of you to deliver. Are you trying to compete with the low cost carriers, and is that the product you're trying to mirror, or are you trying to be the premium carrier? So if you tell your employees that you're trying to elevate the experience and you're asking for their help in doing that, it's a lot easier to get them to do it than just assume they're going to deliver a great service when you're cutting the product and telling them that that we're under threat from Frontier.
That totally, I mean, that makes crystal clear sense. I think, it's easy to talk about in like a business school class context or whatever of, oh, you have one player who's the low cost and the other is the premium, and there's virtues to operating both ways and profits to be found both. But of course, as you say, it's easier to espouse the virtues of saying, hey, we're the best. Let's just, go out every day and perform accordingly. And we have the liberty to do that and the budget to do so as well. And that, of course, drives the mission on a business level as well.
And United has gotten better, and I don't think, and a part of that really began when Jeff Smisek was forced out as CEO in the New Jersey Bridgegate scandal, right? It came out that because of that, that political scandal, it came out that the chairman of the Port Authority in New York, New Jersey asked for a flight for his own benefit that would take him to his vacation home. And the CEO of the airline that he was meeting with, he says, look, if you want your stuff on the Port Authority agenda, this is what I need. And the CEO, former general counsel, like, his first call wasn't to the FBI, right? His response was like, okay.
Northeast politicians love a free flight. What could I say? Seems to be the.
And so he was forced out, and he was this tremendous cost cutter. I mean, he was cutting $2 billion of expense, and he called it Project Quality, right? Like, like that was like, it was like this newspeak, thing. And they, in this huge hurry, they had to like find a new CEO. They grabbed Oscar Munoz off their board. He had never run an airline, but he'd been on the Continental board for a while, and he'd run a railroad. Like, okay, but he was really good with people. And what he did is so he wasn't necessarily this great airline executive, but he traveled the system. He talked to employees, and he motivated them, and he convinced them that they had a bright future as an airline and that he needed their help. And it was this great service that they were providing that was the key. And then he started giving them tools, and he started with economy. Right? He started with snacks and back, the stroopwafel and illy coffee. Right? Everyone hated the coffee. They call it the fresh brew brand coffee that they call fresh poo. By the way, it's what American still serves, right? And the snacks, and he says, and they're delicious together. And most passengers are in back, and here's the symbol of getting rid of the like misery of the past here, and we're investing in the product, and we're talking to our people. And that was the beginning, right, 10 years ago, of turning things around for them. But they didn't do all of the things that Delta had done with their New York position, with real estate and product and operational reliability. They're not, United's not as reliable as Delta, but also with storytelling. Delta is phenomenal at marketing themselves.
They have real evangelists, unlike other. I mean, it feels like, yeah.
But when they do something good, they have to claim it's 100 times as good as it is. Okay. Like, and so they have to have their CEO show up in the Sphere at the Computer Electronics Show, right, to announce a deal with DraftKings that wasn't even signed yet.
That's interesting. Good to know. Interesting.
And they weren't saying anything about it, except now, after I started writing that, that doing gambling in their onboard entertainment system is actually illegal. And I went through the legislative history of this. Oh no, we're not going to violate any laws. Okay. We're not going to we don't actually know what it is yet. We can't tell you because the deal's not signed. Okay. But there's this tremendous exaggeration in their culture, but that talks about premium. There are things that they do that are premium. And in fact, you earlier said that the last few years, maybe the most premium thing they did, they haven't brought back, but they actually started doing in 2019, which was the international economy experience where they were serving welcome drinks in coach, they were giving amenity kits in coach, they were doing coursed meals where it was like mix and match. You could pick your appetizer.
I must have missed that year of flying.
Well, I mean, it started in 2019 and it went away with the pandemic. So it didn't actually last very long and it's not back. But that was really, as I say, most passengers are economy passengers, right? And that was, about that was probably the most premium thing we had seen from a US airline in, long haul economy, since deregulation.
Well, you bring up a good point. So maybe we can, talk a little bit about brand perception. So maybe just to recap, there's been largely equal footing on M&A. Again, people have some have had better deals than others. Obviously, as you mentioned, Delta had this win on their regional slots, but to whatever degree, United has a large Chicago presence as well as American. All three play in LA, Dallas, between, or I should say Texas area between United and American is well positioned, and Delta similarly. They each have their hubs and strongholds, which you can debate geographical advantages ad nauseum. But ultimately, as you said, like a lot of this does come down to the marketing and the incrementalities of the product. And if I think about it, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but if I'm thinking of the big three airlines, and I had to attribute one word, with Delta, it's probably like relatively premium. United, I think, international network and connectivity. And American, I think, I don't know, the cheapest of the three, usually. And we can maybe leave American for another episode because that's a whole other debacle. But we're kind of getting into nuances here. But how have they each defined themselves, and how does that contribute? Why is United going in the direction that they're going, and how would Delta justify their own turn?
Look, 20 years ago, well, certainly if you go back 45 to deregulation, I mean, it really was, you had a commodity product. Seats were a commodity product. The technology around selling the seats was, treated them as a commodity product. You had schedule, you had price. That was what was in the computer reservation systems. And you didn't really communicate more than that. And, marketing, maybe there was a magazine ad, right? Back before frequent flyer programs, and you couldn't even tell where a purchase came from. So one of the interesting innovations, the frequent flyer programs basically did two things, right? I mean, one is it took a commodity product and attempted to de-commoditize it, tried to create a consumer preference so that maybe you would wait a couple hours for the less, for the less convenient flight, or you would pay a little more for your brand preference for what was still the commodity product experience. The other thing that it did was create a huge data-driven marketing opportunity. So you're now connecting passengers and purchasing decisions, and instead of, here, we're going to take out a magazine ad for a new route, right? I mean, it used to be people would say, oh, if airlines could like go back in time and not have frequent flyer programs, and they have, oh, this is expensive giving away those free flights, they would totally do that. Obviously, that's dumb because they have this incredible, credit card revenue, and they've turned the, marketing expense line into a profit center. This incredible driver of profit, but it's also incredibly, data-driven marketing from the very beginning. So we didn't used to know whether a magazine ad was effective for a new route or not. Right now we do, one-to-one permission-driven marketing, and we know what a marketing message does at the individual consumer level.
Let alone price discrimination to the nickel,
And so this was the beginning of transforming from commodity to a much more particularized product. But for a long time, the technology lagged behind. You used to have first class domestic airfares where there was like there were a bunch of coach fares, and then there's the first class airfare, and there really wasn't a differentiation there. And it was expensive, and it might be 4, 5, and 6 times as expensive as the coach ticket. And so very few people purchased it. When I started flying for work, 30 years ago, 10% or so of the passengers up front were there on tickets that have been purchased in first class. And that meant it was easy for employees to sit up there. It was easy for upgrades and awards to sit up there because no one was buying those seats. And one of the early innovations was just the ability to price differently. So for instance, to price as an increment above whatever the prevailing coach fare was. So maybe you'd price $200 or $300 more for first class. And then people started buying it because you're not now charging $1,800 more. And some of this was driven by early low-cost carriers like AirTran that had premium cabin, and they were selling the premium cabin at a discount. And so the major carriers had to respond, or they were going to lose. Maybe they were offering a marginally better product than AirTran, but you still got the bigger seat, and it was only $700, not $2,100, to buy. And so there was that spurred the innovation. But there really did begin this process of de-commoditization, in some sense with the frequent flyer programs, but more in earnest with technological innovations, 20 years ago. And it was a very slow and gradual process. But and that Delta says that they saw, when they started talking 10 years ago about increasingly selling, these premium seats. But it's also been, a consumer preference evolution that truly did accelerate with the pandemic. The percentage of consumers who are willing to spend more than just the lowest price.
Yeah, what was the percentage that Ed Bastian touted? Like 87% of their first class seat miles are paid customers. Something like that. I might be mistaking the number, but something crazy high.
Yeah, so it was Glenn Howenstein, the president at their investor day, that gave that number. And when he says paid, this isn't paying necessarily that you go buy a first class ticket. It includes buy-ups and include at whatever price, right? So you're paying some amount of money.
Last second discrepancy that they'll try to sell you on. Yeah.
They sell, look, they'll sell, I've seen Seattle to Europe at $299 as a buy-up from Coach, right? And that counts.
I'd jump on that. Absolutely.
Right. Yeah. I mean, but they've become willing. They've done much more aggressive in their merchandising. They do follow-up marketing that they never used to do.
I mean, even if you think of the data required to give you the $299 offer versus my like $345 offer, and whatever goes into that algorithm is insane.
And they change the offers based on who they're marketing to, how many times they've marketed it. They may come back to you with a lower price. They may come back to you with a higher price. And so you don't know. And so you want to jump on it.
When I was a college student, I always aspired to be a data analyst, even for one of these airlines, just to like get to look at just the wealth of what they're looking at. Like, I can't imagine the profiles they have built on individual customers.
But now be glad that you're not, because Delta also at that investor day revealed that they're pricing about 1% of their product already using AI with an Israeli firm, and that they think that this is going to grow. And what struck me as bizarre that shortly after that investor day, there was a congressional hearing where where members of Congress are railing against Spirit and Frontier for their fees, where they make customers log in before they're being quoted all the fee add-ons. Right. And so maybe it's personalized pricing. And Delta declared they're using AI for personalized pricing, and nobody gives them a hard time. I'm like, how do they get away with it? They've got, they're very.
It's unbelievable. Well, actually, so I want to come back to this, and I think pricing will be an important lever as we end the segment on the future. But it's critical that we talk about credit card points as we were going into marketing and just the entire world of loyalty as we've been discussing it. So I'll give you a loose leash here and just let's get into it.
Look, so Delta, as we're saying, is has this great better operational reliability, this great brand that sometimes exceeds the actual product. I mean, look, Delta's business class on their Boeing 767s, which is a workhorse across the Atlantic, actually lags the product of United and American, like frankly by quite a lot, right? But they have tremendous branding, and customers, and this positioning in important spending markets like New York and Los Angeles, as well as this, if you're going to fly, in Atlanta and the upper Midwest, they inherited these markets from Northwest, and the Northwest executives used to say, it's cold, it's dark, no one wants to go there, but it's all ours. Right. And so Delta has this great market positioning, great brand, good reliability. And so people choose Delta for their frequent flyer program, as their carrier of choice. And then by extension for their credit card, even when it doesn't make sense for them to. Like, you shouldn't ever put $1 of spending on an airline credit card unless you're doing it for the purpose of contributing towards your elite status. Because even if you wanted Delta miles, you will earn more Delta miles with an American Express membership rewards product that earns points with faster accelerator categories than the Delta cards offer. Right? And then you can transfer them to Delta.
My one yearly purchase on my Delta Reserve pains me as I swipe it, because I know I'm not maximizing efficiency in that moment.
but but if you're spending for status, like, I can at least understand the argument, although potentially less so because you're almost never getting upgraded because 87% of the first class seats are monetized.
The $1 million question I've been asking myself.
Which is why often it's mid-tier status that's kind of a sweet spot in a way. Or I have my comp to Air France Gold from Built Rewards that gets me at least free Delta exit row seats and priority boarding. Good enough for those times I fly Delta. I'm not a Delta frequent flyer. But the point is that with this brand position, they've been able to generate more revenue off of their co-brand credit card partnership than anyone else. If you turn back the clock 7 years, American used to have the biggest transaction volume on their co-brand credit card. American at their last investor day said they've fallen to third, but they view that as upside, right? So United's in the number two position. They're generating over $5 billion a year. Delta's generating about $7 billion in revenue from their credit card, and this is high margin revenue. And we don't necessarily look to the exact numbers that they self-reported. They usually report very little, but during the pandemic, they were raising money against the future income streams of their loyalty programs, and so they had to disclose more information, right?
It's like a bank business model almost. I mean, it's crazy to think how they're operating. Yeah.
So Delta disclosed a 39% operating margin for Sky Miles. American just claimed that theirs was a 52% margin. Now, a lot of this has to do with just their own internal price.
Against, by the way, I should add a 10% operating margin on average for the entire company, right? So this is just to underline the discrepancy of how much upside you're getting with these programs.
Well, and at American in a given quarter, I mean, excluding their loyalty revenue, they're often losing money, right? Their cost per seat mile is greater than their revenue, and so this is driving profit. Now, how they internally price things matters for what they assign as the profit of the loyalty program versus, so how much are they charging for seats and whatnot, back and forth. So it's not really the case that Advantage is, substantially more profitable than Sky Miles, right? But the point is that when their range of profit margins is 39 to 52%, it is incredibly high margin revenue that they're generating by selling miles to primarily banks, but not only to banks. And so the loyalty business is huge. The airline, United, Delta, and American each raised between $6.5 and $10 billion a piece in debt against their loyalty program revenue, right? Which is incredible. Before the pandemic, people were a little bit shy. They weren't always believing, that it was as big a deal. American had their Advantage program appraised at between 18 and $30 billion, right? And when you're talking about an airline that doesn't have a $10 billion market cap, it's like, well, okay, what's going now? It is not the case that they should cut out the middleman, stop flying, and just have a loyalty program. They wouldn't be able to generate the revenue. People wouldn't use the credit card.
Though they are moving in the direction, what is it? You don't have to fly on a single American airline plane, in theory, to get executive platinum, right? Which is somewhat opposite to United's system.
Well, this is absolutely true because look, I mean, the high margin revenue for an airline is selling miles to the banks, right? Or any ancillary revenue, seat fees, check bag fees, your upgrade fees, priority boarding fees, change fees. These are all high margin, right? The actual ticket is not high margin. The business of transporting, it's still a commodity business, even though it's somewhat decommoditized, even though there is a brand preference, even though Delta is able to generate higher revenue from customers for essentially the same transportation from A to B than its competitors. But anyway, so the point with the loyalty programs is that, but it's not just those redeemable miles. Right. So it's also the status program. Every loyalty program is effectively two things bundled. It's the recognition, right, and reward. Recognition is your status, reward is the rebate. And Delta, even though Delta has found there are limits to how far they can push customers. So 15 months ago, they announced big changes to their status earning that were going to lean much farther into requiring huge credit card spend and to be able to get the same level of service. They're still requiring credit card spend for their premium credit card holders to have unlimited access to their lounges, which their competitors still bundle unlimited access just with having that premium card. Delta got incredibly scared. I mean, Amex did too. They backed off very quickly.
I'll admit I was one of the Reddit warriors fighting against the changes. Absolutely.
Well, look, I mean, they're not, they say otherwise, but clearly they saw the data in customer cancellations of American Express cards and in what their elite behavior was in bookings. And it frightened them and they backed off. And then they added other sweeteners like more generous million mile status. And, I wondered whether, after a year they would kind of at least begin to inch back, and they didn't announce those changes for this year either. So they really did so they found some limit to how far they could push their customers, right?
But they found the wall. That's right. Well, I think, the question I'd written out ahead of this was, I mean, we've basically been talking our way through the P&L. And if I look at the big cost items, as nothing surprising, it's the hardware, it's the headcount, it's the operations. And as we've said, like Delta's pretty efficient on all of that. So there's, not presumably a big trove of costs to cut out. So is the future, if we're looking 10 years forward, just a function of price increases, or alternatively, maybe a rosier view, as I've seen specifically with Delta, they've released Delta Vacations, which in my opinion hardly works on the back end, but then they have all these partnerships. Is it that we'll see Delta 20 years from now is no longer an airline company, but a travel company? Or how do you see this evolving?
So there's a couple different things. First of all, I mean, their partnership with DraftKings is really interesting, because 30 years ago, the Department of Transportation was on the verge of kind of endorsing gambling in the air. And the Clinton administration kind of backed them off of that because they were going to do a national study on gambling. They didn't want to kind of front run this. But at the time, they were estimating that if you were to adjust for inflation and the current fleet size, an airline the size of Delta, United, or American would each generate an extra $1 billion a year from in-flight gambling. So huge potential business. Now you've got DraftKings partnership, you've got you've got a new administration. Maybe they're more friendly to it, maybe they're against it. I don't know. I wouldn't be surprised to see lobbying test the waters to see, whether something were possible, maybe with the next FAA reauthorization.
And so what you were talking about here is basically just like monetizing airtime as it is.
Yeah, I mean, look, that's something that's been, that United is working on with they're trying to take their in-flight entertainment and turn it into, they call it connected media, and it's very personalized direct advertising and selling the eyeballs of a high value, affluent demographic. And, they make you watch ads to get your free internet kind of thing. And that now that they have the bandwidth coming online with Starlink, United, Delta invested in the bandwidth. To get your free internet on Delta, you have to join the loyalty program, which lets them direct market to you first the credit card and convert you, because they've kind of tapped out how many people they can get to sign up for that. They want to get more people that they, at the top of the funnel, but also to market other things too, like gambling, like DraftKings. But also Delta has another interesting model going on here. Delta has significant investments in airlines all over the world, right? So it's not the US market's pretty mature, and not every market is. Now, so I mean, other airlines have joint ventures, and Delta has this. So there are in most cases, most countries limit foreign ownership of their airlines, and the US does as well. But joint ventures are effectively a way around that. Antitrust immunized, you can set pricing together and share your revenue on a set of routes, but you can't actually merge. And that all dates back. I mentioned, the authority granted to the Department of Transportation to waive antitrust for international price inclusion for IATA, and that they used that for the first time with giving antitrust immunity to Northwest and KLM to enter into the first joint venture. And then the federal government got quite behind that because they used it as a carrot. They said, look, we're only going to approve these in the event that the US has an open skies treaty with the home country of the airline, the counterparty. And so it became leverage to get countries to agree to open skies, which was a priority for the US. And so we have all these joint ventures, between the US and Europe, with American and British Air.
And is that primarily like an asset agreement, but it really drives revenue at the end of the day, right? It's like a yearly, yeah, go ahead.
So they're splitting revenue and cost, right? And they're deciding who flies where based on whose plane is best suited, who's who's going to do best in that market. And and they set schedules and pricing together, and they share revenue and cost, basically. But Delta owns 49% of Virgin Atlantic, right? Delta owns as and effectively oftentimes with less than.
What's the new Middle Eastern airline that's dropping next year or something like that? Am I misremembering?
So they're going to partner with Riyadh Air.
Riyadh Air, that's right.
And Riyadh Air is throwing around incredible amounts of money for their launch, and they're going to fly to Atlanta. Of all the what they're paying Delta for this deal, we don't know, but that's their splash into the market. And Delta already partners with Saudia, the other state-backed airline in Saudi Arabia, right? And but Delta has stakes in Aeromexico. They have a stake in Air France. They have a stake in China Eastern, right? And in Korean Air. They have a joint venture with Korean Air, but they also have an ownership stake, and that's and an outsized influence because they increase their stake to help the owners of Korean Air stay in control of the company.
And the Asiana buyout as well, I believe, right?
And well, now, I mean, they have it actually blows. I really did not expect the antitrust approval for for Korean Air and Asiana, who basically control in and out of Seoul. And there's very little U.S. Seoul flying outside of the Delta joint venture under this deal, but but that went through. But my point being is,
And so, yeah, maybe backing up, like as we kind of close it off, looking today, the market is, as we've said, like these 3 to 6 players, of which like 3 are major contenders. Is this somewhat of a steady state, or do we like, how do you, if I'm asking you to look into your crystal ball, how is it going to all turn out?
so if we allow the regulatory environment to permit innovation, it is not going to be a steady state, because we will have, I don't know which manufacturer will be first to market with approved vertical takeoff and landing, short takeoff and landing aircraft. So what we have first for short distance flights, you're going to have electric air taxis, right? But also short takeoff and landing for 100 and 200-mile flights until we get batteries that last longer, but that'll offer more point-to-point flying between that some of these, look, you take a you don't even need an airport.
Oh, right. It changes the whole infrastructure model behind airlines. Yeah.
Right. So short takeoff and landing, you do a 100-mile flight from from a stadium, right? Stadium parking lot. But you'll also be feeding hubs with the electric air taxis, but bypassing hubs with 100 and 200-mile flights. But to do that, these are all being designed as smaller aircraft, 9, 16, and 30-seat aircraft. 9, 18, and 30-seat aircraft for a reason, because these are regulatory breakpoint in what's written, what's required. With more than 9 seats, you need 2 pilots. More than 18 seats, you need a flight attendant. More than 30 seats, you're going to have to operate from a commercial terminal, use TSA. You're subject to pilot training rules and pilot retirement rules, and you have to pay a lot more for pilots. But if we allow Part 135 operations, which American Southwest and ALPA had been lobbying basically to get the FAA to crack down on, they said they would, and then they ran out of time in the Biden administration to do it. So if we allow those operations, we get the investment in the electric aircraft that will disrupt the domestic market, right? And how that operates, and with it, what it means, what airports are in use, what it means to need an airport, new security rules and environments. So there's the potential for real disruption. In the meantime, in the current model, right? I mean, I think it is greater product differentiation that customers are willing to pay for, and extracting greater consumer surplus while delivering greater consumer value, and diversifying across different airline markets, because, as I say, at least in the current model, the U.S. market's fairly mature, as Delta has done with airlines around the world.
And so, to clarify, you do believe in a future of increasing consumer value. It's not a race to the bottom of, stacking economy class like sardines.
Well, all this fundamentally depends on the regulatory environment, right? So if you have a fixed supply of gates and slots, and you allocate them to incumbent players and protect them, right? Then you don't necessarily see you don't necessarily see a universe of greater consumer experience, right? So the answer is it depends on what we allow. And the US is sort of interesting in that, in many countries in the world, security isn't performed by the same agency that regulates it, right? That airports aren't all owned by, local governments. Air traffic control isn't just government regulated, it's also government provided here, right? In Canada, you have a stakeholder nonprofit that does it. Airlines are charged for the service, instead of billing taxpayers, and they're better at investing in technology. Like, we're 30 years behind Canada in air traffic control technology because our congressional appropriations process, they're forced to invest on an annual basis rather than making capital investments. And in Canada,
A grim reality, which hopefully, we'll confront in the coming years.
yeah. But these also limit the throughput of the skies. And so the question is, like, what model we want, because a lot of it is, regulatory. It's a lot, sort of cordoned off or sort of bounded by, government policy. So if we allow some of the innovation, then we'll see a lot more innovation. It'll be competitive, and, both opportunities for profit as well as delivering greater experiences to customers. But we have to, unleash that. We have to permit it.
It depends. Yeah, I know it's really, I mean, at once scary, but also very realistic to appreciate the importance of regulation. And I mean, even if we go back on throughout this whole conversation, like deregulation, which in its of itself is a form of policy, was cataclysmic in a positive way for the entire industry. So as you say, it's really that's a big lever to pull, and one that we'll have to wait to see and how it builds.
And worth remembering that almost the entire industry was against it, right? So that, deregulation was favored only by United Airlines and what was then the Frontier, and the rest of the industry was against it. And it was championed by Ralph Nader and Senator Ted Kennedy as a pro-consumer move, right? Breaking up this oligopoly, right? And so that was because people forget that it was regulatory capture, right? It was regulation to benefit the airlines and prevent competition, and that's often what we get is that, that's who has the greatest voice in regulatory matters. It's not like we can regulate to, to tamp down, the businesses and help consumers. Like, it rarely happens.
Yeah, it's often, and vestiges of that still perhaps exist today, you could argue, but certainly it's hard to imagine the comparison with as it was then. And even just like the route density and the airlines as businesses as they've come today are entirely by function of that competitive landscape. So anyways, thank you, Gary, for diving so deep into it. The insight you provided is, I would say in many accounts, one that could not be replicated with infinite hours of research online. So thank you so much for your time, and loved chatting with you about it.
Very good. Cheers. Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to Company Breakdowns. Make sure you're subscribed on Spotify, Apple, or YouTube. Let us know in the comments or reviews what companies you want us to deep dive on next. Company Breakdowns is a show from Turpentine, the network behind Moment of Zen, Turpentine VC, Turpentine Finance, and Request for Startups.